When people begin to come out, they begin to experience a lot of psychological problems, a lot of depression, a lot of anger once they begin to realize how much control that existed over their lives. Very often, in the stages of people accepting their own death or the death of a loved one, there are certain stages that people go through, and they're very similar, interestingly, to the stages that individuals go through in recovering from cults. And very often, one of the first things is disbelief. I know when I was disfellowshipped, it was shock, total and utter shock that this had happened to me. I think I wandered around for months in just shell shock from it. The anger didn't hit for a long time, but very often people get angry that how could they do this to me? And then very often a depression will set in. A lot of people commit suicide. And sadly, this is covered up because that control of information that they have, they don't let people know that when somebody has left the organization and committed suicide, they don't want anybody to know that there's a connection. And they'll say, well, it was anything else except how they were treated. Very often people go through a bargaining stage, or they'll try to well, maybe the organization wasn't so bad, maybe it was me, maybe I can go to meetings sometimes. So there's this whole period where people will kind of, maybe can have one foot in, one foot out, and they'll try that, or they'll say they'll just go back. A lot of people find that because of the language control and being separated from other people for so long, they find it hard to reintegrate into the world. So they kind of figure it's just easier to go back to what they knew, and they'll go through the trial periods and get reinstated. And then some people will either accommodate to living outside of the organization and just kind of still believe what the organization taught but not want to live it. And some people will be able to have full acceptance of the experience and heal towards, yes, that was a negative experience, but I can still grow and move past it. And it's a very difficult challenge for people to move through these stages, because very often they've been told for years that there's something wrong with them, rather than there's something wrong with what they've been taught. And especially if they've been taught, again, this information comes from God, it becomes more and more difficult for a person to believe that it's not them. You know, it's like, well, me or God. And the organization, in the case of the witnesses, kind of winds up being lost in there. And yet, they're the real middlemen that are controlling everything. It took me 10 years after coming out of the group to even begin to read any information about Jehovah's Witnesses and their mind control techniques, or even anything at all about them that was negative. And a lot of people will say, well, then it couldn't have been so bad because, you continued to believe it for a long time, and, you went off and lived life. And my response to that is that the mind control techniques are so strong that even after leaving for 10 years, they still had an effect. And that's how powerful mind control really is. That even years, decades after leaving, a person can still be under the influence. Yeah. Well, what will happen for a lot of people is, well, if God has expelled me from the organization, then I must be a horrible person. And people will live up to or down to the reputation that's put on them. And so a lot of people will just go out and live the life that we were told ex-members lived. It becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy, and we act it out. Not all do, because some actually are able to go on and live, kind of not go in that direction. Probably more of rebellion than anything else. But many people follow that route of drugs and alcohol and all of the things that the witnesses said would happen if you left. And then they can stand there and say, see? and the person says, well, you see, they were right for throwing me out. In reality, the drugs and alcohol and just misabuse of yourself is just a self-inflicted. It's the anger turned inward instead of out at the organization, which you've been taught is out towards God, which is not allowed. You turn it inward and you die inside. And it takes a lot for people to begin to move into taking a look at what happened, because there's so much fear put about it. It's like you're getting, basically aligning yourself with Satan if you start reading anything about the organization. It's becoming what they said you would become, which would be useless. So there's, and going to church for the first time is a real challenge, because you're entering Satan's house, basically. And people have tremendous fears years and years after leaving, because the techniques are so strong. Not because this was, just a simple choice that people made. It took me a couple of years of reading material after the 10 years, and then another couple of years of reading, before I had the courage to go into a church. And even then I went with like a friend on each side, because the fear of, being struck dead by walking into a church was so enormous that I felt like a cripple. But the interesting thing is, when I came out of there, and I was scared the whole time. I just sat there the whole time going, oh my God, God's going to see me in here. The more I went, I came out feeling free and light, and lighter than I ever had before. And it wasn't like, my girlfriend tried to say it's because God has, blessed you or supported you or whatever. I don't know how I feel about that. But I think what it was releasing all the bounds that were around me, that were chaining me down into thinking that walking into a church was such a horrible thing, and that I was such a horrible thing for having left. The reality is, I still believe in God, and I don't think that I really believe He understands what I've been through and will support me. Don't know how He does that, but but I felt free of the chains that had held me down for so long. And that where I lived, there was a staircase, 100 steps. I never used to be able to run those 2 at a time, but after this experience and being set free, I was running up those stairs 2 at a time. I had energy because I wasn't using all of my energy to hold me down. And I think that's something a lot of people experience when they get this sense of freedom from all the chains that have been put on their minds and their bodies, that they have more energy because they're not using it to keep themselves restrained. So there are a lot of benefits of allowing yourself to be free and looking at the information. One of the challenges I found was that as a witness you're told not to talk to ex-witnesses. The interesting thing I found was that as an ex-witness, I still believed and followed for the 10 years that rule not to talk to ex-witnesses. So here I was, an ex-witness, still not talking to ex-witnesses, which is what I really needed to do. I really needed to talk to other people who had left and to find out that life can be good after being in a cult. And it can be wonderful and freeing. And those rules just kept me chained for another 10 years. Because if I had managed to see that I could to talk to other ex-members, then I probably would have been freer a lot earlier.